21 black celebrities whose partners died of incurable diseases. They had money power and global admiration, yet none of it could stop what came next. Behind the applause, behind the flawless performances, some of the greatest black legends in history were fighting battles no spotlight could expose. Illness entered their homes quietly, dismantling love careers and certainty one hospital night at a time. These are not rumors. These are lives forever changed. Before you judge their choices or their endings, ask yourself, what would you do if fame couldn't save the person you love? Comment below and subscribe to Legends of Black Fame for stories history rarely tells. Sidney Poitier. Sidney Poitier stood for decades as a symbol of dignity, restraint, and moral strength in American cinema. As the first black actor to win the Academy Award for Best Actor, his presence reshaped Hollywood and altered how black excellence was perceived on screen. Yet beyond awards and history books, Poitier's private life revealed a man deeply affected by the quiet, unglamorous trials that fame cannot prevent, especially when illness enters a marriage. Born in the Bahamas and raised in poverty, Poitier understood struggle long before success. That early resilience shaped his public image, but personal hardship later arrived in a far more intimate form. During his long life, Poitier experienced the emotional weight of caring for loved ones whose health declined, a reality he addressed with rare honesty in interviews and memoirs. He often reflected that illness strips away illusion, leaving only fear, responsibility, and love in its rawest state. Unlike the dramatic narratives often exaggerated online, Poitier never portrayed himself as a tragic hero battling fate. Instead, he emphasized endurance. He spoke about how long periods of sickness within a household can change the emotional balance of a relationship, how routines dissolve, priorities narrow, and even success loses meaning when measured against mortality. For a man whose career depended on control and composure, helplessness was the most difficult lesson. Poitier eventually stepped away from acting at the height of his relevance, not because he lacked opportunity, but because life demanded a different kind of presence. He believed that standing beside family during moments of vulnerability mattered more than maintaining visibility. That decision, rarely acknowledged in popular summaries of his life, reflected a philosophy grounded in responsibility rather than ambition. In his later years, Poitier described aging itself as a prolonged negotiation with decline, physical, emotional, and spiritual. He did not romanticize suffering, nor did he deny its impact. Instead, he framed it as a teacher that forces clarity. Fame fades quickly, health unpredictably, but character remains. Sidney Poitier's legacy is often celebrated through film history. Yet his quieter truth lies in how he faced the limits of power, learning that love does not always heal, but it always asks to stay. Curtis Mayfield. Curtis Mayfield's life is often remembered for its brilliance, a songwriter whose voice helped shape the conscience of America during the Civil Rights era. Through music like People Get Ready and Move On Up, Mayfield offered hope, spiritual resolve, and quiet resistance. Yet behind those uplifting messages lay a later chapter, defined not by triumph, but by physical limitation and emotional endurance brought on by irreversible illness. In August 1990, Mayfield's life changed instantly when a lighting rig collapsed during an outdoor concert in Brooklyn, crushing his spinal cord. The accident left him paralyzed from the neck down. For a man whose career depended on rhythm, movement, and control, the loss was devastating. He could no longer perform independently, feed himself, or live without assistance. Rehabilitation was slow and incomplete, and the future he had imagined vanished within seconds. Despite the severity of his condition, Mayfield refused to disappear. Using specialized equipment, he continued composing and recording music from his bed, proving that creativity does not rely solely on physical freedom. However, the financial and emotional strain of long-term medical care was enormous. Treatment home modifications and round-the-clock support consumed much of his resources during the final decade of his life. Mayfield's personal world also narrowed. Chronic pain, respiratory complications, and repeated infections became part of daily existence. By the late 1990s, his immune system was severely weakened, and diabetes further complicated his health. In 1999, at the age of 57, Curtis Mayfield died from complications related to his injuries, closing a career that had influenced generations of artists. What defines Mayfield's story is not tragedy alone, but resolve. He transformed immobility into a different kind of strength, refusing bitterness or public spectacle. His later years demonstrated that dignity can exist even when independence is lost. Curtis Mayfield did not conquer illness, but he denied it the power to erase his voice. James Brown. James Brown lived his life at maximum intensity. Known worldwide as the Godfather of Soul, he built a legacy on relentless energy, precision, and dominance of the stage. Yet the same force that fueled his career also shaped a turbulent private life marked by emotional conflict, health crises, and irreversible consequences that fame could not soften. Behind the explosive performances and strict discipline was a man struggling with volatility. Brown's personal relationships were often unstable, strained by substance abuse, legal problems, and erratic behavior. These pressures affected not only him, but those closest to him, particularly his spouses, whose lives unfolded far from the spotlight, yet deeply under its shadow. As Brown aged, his health began to decline steadily. Years of physical exertion, combined with drug use and chronic stress, took a visible toll. He suffered from heart problems, respiratory infections, and prostate cancer later in life. Hospital stays became more frequent, and his once unbreakable stamina weakened. Still, Brown resisted slowing down, continuing to perform long after most peers had retired. In 2006, his condition worsened rapidly. Hospitalized with severe pneumonia, James Brown died on December 25th at the age of 73. His death shocked fans, but for those who knew his private battles, it marked the end of a long physical and emotional struggle. James Brown's story is complex because it blends greatness with damage. He revolutionized music, dance, and performance, but his personal life revealed the cost of living without restraint. Illness did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated quietly, shaped by years of extremes. His legacy remains monumental yet incomplete, without acknowledging the human reality beneath the legend. James Brown was not undone by a single disease, but by a lifetime lived at full volume. Where the body eventually demanded a price, the soul could not negotiate away. Barry White. Barry White's voice carried warmth, romance, and reassurance, becoming one of the most recognizable sounds in soul and R&B history. Audiences associated him with intimacy and emotional certainty, yet his private life revealed a far more fragile reality, one shaped by distance, health decline, and the slow erosion that illness brings to long-term relationships. As his career expanded through the 1970s and 1980s, White spent increasing time in studios and on tour, a schedule that often left little room for domestic stability. While professional success flourished, personal bonds faced strain, especially as health complications began to emerge. White struggled for years with chronic high blood pressure, obesity, and kidney disease conditions that progressively limited his energy and independence. By the late 1990s, his medical situation had worsened significantly. Kidney failure required frequent dialysis, tethering him to hospitals rather than stages. Treatments were physically draining, often lasting hours and leaving him exhausted. The contrast between his commanding recorded presence and his real-life vulnerability grew stark. Public appearances became rare, and recording sessions slowed, as his body resisted the pace his career once demanded. Illness also reshaped his emotional world. Long periods of treatment introduced isolation, forcing reflection rather than performance. Relationships that had already been strained by absence faced additional pressure under the weight of uncertainty and fatigue. Love, once expressed through music, now required patience, endurance, and acceptance of limits. Barry White died in 2003 at the age of 58 after complications related to kidney failure. His passing marked the end of a career that defined romantic soul music, but it also closed a chapter of prolonged physical struggle endured largely outside public view. White's legacy remains one of passion and emotional honesty, yet his later years remind us that illness does not discriminate by status or success. Even a voice that once symbolized strength could not negotiate with a failing body. His story stands as a quiet reminder that behind timeless music often lies a human cost, rarely heard. Smokey Robinson. Smokey Robinson built his reputation on tenderness. As a songwriter, producer, and performer, he captured vulnerability with rare precision, giving voice to longing, regret, and devotion. Yet the emotional intelligence that shaped his music did not shield him from the strain illness can impose on a marriage or the slow unraveling that chronic disease introduces into daily life. During the height of his success with Motown, Robinson balanced relentless creative demands with family responsibilities. That balance grew increasingly fragile as serious health challenges entered his household. Long-term illness reshapes time itself. Days become structured around symptoms, medications, and unpredictable setbacks. For Robinson, this reality clashed sharply with the pace of touring, recording, and executive leadership. Autoimmune disease, by nature, resists simple solutions. It fluctuates, recedes, and then returns without warning. Such conditions often bring exhaustion rather than spectacle, wearing down relationships quietly. Robinson later acknowledged that prolonged illness can alter emotional closeness, not through lack of care, but through accumulated fatigue and helplessness. As pressure-mounted distance followed, the combination of physical suffering, emotional withdrawal, and professional obligations created separation neither partner initially intended. There was no single breaking point, only years of adjustment that slowly redefined the marriage until its original shape could no longer hold. Unlike dramatic narratives that frame separation as failure, Robinson's story reflects a more common truth: some relationships are changed irreversibly by disease, even when love remains. Caregiving, grief, and guilt coexist, leaving no clear villains and no clean endings. Smokey Robinson survived that chapter and continued his career, but the experience permanently altered his perspective. In later reflections, he spoke more openly about fragility, emphasizing that emotional survival often requires acknowledging limits rather than denying them. His music continues to resonate because it understands loss without dramatizing it. That same restraint defines his personal journey, one shaped not by scandal or spectacle, but by the quiet, enduring impact of illness on human connection. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor was one of the most influential comedians of the 20th century, redefining stand-up through brutal honesty, vulnerability, and self-exposure. His comedy dismantled taboos around race, addiction, trauma, and pain. Yet behind the fearless performances was a man whose body and relationships were slowly worn down by illness and long-term physical decline. In the late 1980s, Pryor began experiencing symptoms that could no longer be ignored: muscle weakness, slurred speech, and loss of coordination. He was eventually diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a progressive neurological disease that attacks the central nervous system. The condition gradually limited his mobility and speech, stripping him of the physical freedom that comedy and life had always depended on. As the disease advanced, Pryor required a wheelchair and daily assistance. Simple actions became exhausting. The man, once known for explosive stage energy, now faced unpredictable spasms, chronic pain, and emotional frustration. Medical care was ongoing and costly, and the psychological impact of losing independence weighed heavily on him. Illness also complicated his personal life. Pryor's marriages were already shaped by past addiction and instability, but multiple sclerosis intensified the strain. Relationships shifted from partnership to caregiving, a transition that often brings grief even when affection remains. Pryor continued to appear publicly when possible, but his presence became quieter, more reflective. Despite physical decline, Pryor refused erasure. He returned to film and television, selectively determined to remain visible on his own terms. His later performances carried a different weight, less explosive, more introspective, revealing a man confronting mortality without abandoning honesty. Richard Pryor died in 2005 at the age of 65 after suffering a heart attack. His legacy is inseparable from his illness, not because disease defined him, but because he allowed audiences to witness vulnerability without disguise. Pryor proved that truth does not vanish when the body weakens, it simply speaks differently. Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman is often associated with calm authority, a voice that suggests wisdom, balance, and reassurance. For decades, his presence conveyed stability, both on screen and off. Yet his personal life reflects a quieter truth. Illness does not always arrive dramatically, nor does it always end relationships. It can slowly change them beyond recognition. Freeman's long marriage unfolded largely outside public attention, but chronic illness eventually became an unspoken force shaping daily life. Autoimmune disease, particularly systemic lupus, is unpredictable and persistent. It attacks internal organs, disrupts energy, and demands constant medical vigilance. Such conditions often progress unevenly, creating cycles of hope and relapse that exhaust both patients and partners. As symptoms intensified over time, routines narrowed, travel became difficult, social engagement faded, medical appointments replaced shared plans. Freeman continued working, often filming far from home, while illness anchored his partner to treatment schedules and recovery periods. Distance grew not from neglect, but from necessity. Caregiving alters emotional dynamics. It replaces spontaneity with responsibility and introduces fear where certainty once lived. Freeman later acknowledged that long-term illness reshapes intimacy, not through lack of compassion, but through sustained pressure that erodes emotional equilibrium. Eventually, separation became unavoidable, not as a rejection, but as an acceptance of irreversible change. Unlike sensationalized narratives, Freeman's story contains no public conflict or scandal tied to illness. There was only quiet withdrawal, mutual fatigue, and the recognition that love alone cannot reverse biology. The relationship ended without spectacle, leaving behind lessons rather than accusations. Morgan Freeman continues to work and reflect on aging with unusual openness. He speaks of fragility not as weakness, but as a reminder of shared humanity. His life illustrates that illness does not always destroy it, transforms, demanding humility even from those who seem unshakable. In that sense, Freeman's story aligns with his screen persona, measured, restrained, and honest. It reminds us that even the calmest voice must sometimes accept silence when the body sets limits no willpower can override. Al Green. Al Green's music radiated tenderness, devotion, and spiritual longing. His falsetto carried vulnerability without weakness, shaping some of soul music's most enduring love songs. Yet the man behind that voice lived through a period where emotional turmoil and mental health struggles within his marriage collided with faith, fear, and irreversible change. During the mid-1970s, as Green's career soared, his personal life became increasingly unstable. His partner at the time struggled with severe psychological distress, including paranoia, anxiety, and emotional volatility. Mental illness rarely announces itself clearly. It unfolds through sleepless nights, sudden mood shifts, and an atmosphere of constant tension. Inside their home, unpredictability replaced harmony. The strain escalated into crisis. Episodes of emotional collapse created an environment where fear and confusion dominated daily life. Green later described this period as one where he felt trapped between responsibility and helplessness, unable to stabilize a situation shaped by forces beyond control. Mental illness does not offer clean solutions, and love alone cannot guarantee safety or healing. In 1974, a violent incident profoundly altered Green's direction. Though he survived physically, the psychological impact lingered. The experience marked a turning point not only in his relationships, but in his identity. Green withdrew from mainstream pop stardom and turned toward gospel music, seeking structure, meaning, and refuge in spirituality. This shift was not an escape from pain, but a response to it. Faith became a framework through which Green attempted to understand suffering rather than deny it. His later work carried restraint instead of seduction, reflection instead of pursuit. Al Green's story demonstrates that illness does not always appear as a medical diagnosis. Psychological distress can be just as destructive, dismantling relationships quietly and suddenly. His legacy includes not only musical brilliance, but the recognition that transformation sometimes begins where certainty ends. Isaac Hayes. Isaac Hayes commanded attention through sound. His deep voice, orchestral arrangements, and commanding presence reshaped soul music and film scoring. Known globally for Theme from Shaft, Hayes embodied confidence and control. Privately, however, his later years were marked by sustained caregiving, financial sacrifice, and the slow erosion that terminal illness imposes on a family. In the late 1990s, Hayes' wife was diagnosed with advanced cancer. The prognosis was severe, and treatment required aggressive intervention. Chemotherapy, extended hospital stays, and palliative care became part of daily life. Hayes shifted his focus from performance to presence, reorganizing his world around medical schedules and uncertain outcomes. The financial burden was substantial. Cancer treatment in the United States is notoriously expensive even for those with successful careers. Hayes sold personal assets and scaled back professional commitments to ensure continuity of care. Fame offered no exemption from cost or emotional exhaustion. Each decision carried urgency, measured not in profit, but in time. Caregiving reshaped Hayes's identity. Nights were spent waiting, listening, and managing pain rather than composing or touring. Creative output slowed, replaced by vigilance and fatigue. He later admitted to close friends that nothing in his career prepared him for watching someone he loved deteriorate day by day. When his wife's condition worsened and consciousness faded, Hayes faced the final stage of anticipatory grief, the quiet mourning that begins before loss officially arrives. Her death ended a chapter defined by devotion rather than applause. Isaac Hayes continued working afterward, but something fundamental had shifted. The confidence that once fueled his public persona softened into reflection. His experience underscored a reality shared by many families. Illness does not merely affect the patient, it redraws the emotional and economic boundaries of everyone involved. Hayes's legacy includes innovation and influence, but also the unseen strength required to remain present when no solution exists. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye's voice carried emotional depth, unlike any other tender, wounded, and searching. His music explored intimacy, doubt, and inner conflict with rare openness. Yet the vulnerability that made his art timeless also defined his personal life, where mental health struggles and emotional instability slowly unraveled his marriage and sense of safety. Gaye's relationship with Anna Gordy, who was significantly older and deeply connected to Motown's inner circle, began with admiration and shared ambition. Over time, however, the marriage became burdened by anxiety, paranoia, and emotional distress. Anna suffered from severe mental health challenges that manifested as fear, isolation, and recurring panic. These conditions did not remain private. They shaped the atmosphere of their home and strained every interaction. Mental illness is rarely static. Episodes intensified during periods of stress, and Marvin, already battling his own insecurity and substance dependence, found himself unable to provide stability. Instead, both partners became trapped in cycles of accusation, withdrawal, and exhaustion. Hospital visits and emergency interventions became part of their reality, reflecting a household governed by unpredictability rather than peace. The marriage ultimately collapsed under prolonged strain. Divorce proceedings were bitter and public, amplifying emotional damage rather than resolving it. For Gaye, the breakdown deepened, existing depression and paranoia feeding into the themes of alienation that later dominated his music. His work during this period carried heavier tones, reflecting a man fractured by love he could not sustain. Marvin Gaye's later years were marked by instability rather than healing. The unresolved impact of illness, both his own and his partner's, left him emotionally unmoored. While his artistic legacy remains monumental, his personal life reveals how untreated mental health conditions can quietly destroy relationships long before they end formally. Gaye's story reminds us that emotional illness can be as devastating as physical disease. It does not announce itself dramatically, but it erodes trust, intimacy, and safety over time. His music survives because it captured that truth honestly, without solutions, without comfort, only recognition. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's public image has always been one of disciplined intellect and quiet authority. Standing at 7 feet 2 inches, He dominated basketball through precision rather than spectacle. Yet beyond championships and records, Abdul-Jabbar faced a private chapter defined by helplessness, watching illness reshape a marriage beyond repair. During the mid-1970s, his wife was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, a condition that disrupts metabolism, breathing, and vocal function. Treatment was aggressive and prolonged. Surgery, radiation, and recovery cycles consumed daily life, replacing routine with uncertainty. For an athlete whose life revolved around control and conditioning, the inability to protect someone he loved was deeply unsettling. Abdul-Jabbar attempted to balance professional obligations with caregiving, but distance grew. Hospital environments became emotionally overwhelming, while the demands of a public career required constant movement. Illness narrowed their shared world, forcing difficult conversations about dependence, fear, and identity. Chronic disease alters relationship dynamics. It shifts equality into imbalance, independence into reliance. Over time, emotional fatigue replaced closeness. His wife, unwilling to define herself through illness, chose separation rather than prolonged vulnerability. The decision left Abdul-Jabbar confronting a reality no physical strength could change. The marriage ended quietly, without scandal or public conflict. Yet its impact lingered. Abdul-Jabbar later reflected that illness exposes limits not only of the body, but of partnership. Love, he learned, cannot always withstand the weight of prolonged suffering. Years later, Abdul-Jabbar faced his own cancer diagnosis, deepening his understanding of vulnerability from the opposite perspective. That experience reshaped his outlook on compassion and endurance. His story underscores a difficult truth: disease does not measure worth, effort, or fame. It interrupts lives indiscriminately, forcing choices that leave no winners, only survivors carrying lessons they never asked to learn. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. lived at the intersection of brilliance and burden. As a singer, dancer, and actor, he embodied versatility and charisma, thriving in an industry that rarely welcomed performers who looked like him. Yet behind the elegance and effortless charm was a life marked by physical decline and the slow accumulation of illness that fame could not outrun. Davis faced health challenges long before the final years of his life. A devastating car accident in 1954 cost him his left eye, forcing him to adapt not only physically but psychologically. While he returned to the stage with determination, the injury marked the beginning of a lifelong negotiation with vulnerability. Over time, additional health issues emerged, including throat cancer in the late 1980s. The diagnosis was severe. Cancer of the larynx threatened not only his life, but the very instrument that defined him, his voice. Treatment required aggressive radiation and surgery procedures that left him weakened and altered his ability to perform. For an artist whose identity was built on sound and presence, the loss was deeply destabilizing. As his condition worsened, Davis continued working longer than medically advised, driven by both financial pressure and a refusal to surrender visibility. Medical bills mounted, and years of inconsistent financial management compounded stress during a period when rest was critical. Illness narrowed his world, replacing stages with clinics and rehearsals with recovery sessions. Sammy Davis Jr. died in 1990 at the age of 64. His death closed a career defined by resilience, but also revealed the cost of constant performance. Davis's story is not one of defeat, but of endurance, carried too far of a man who gave everything to his craft, even when his body demanded retreat. His legacy endures not only through entertainment history, but as a reminder that illness does not pause for applause. It demands attention, humility, and acceptance, lessons learned painfully behind the curtain. Magic Johnson. Magic Johnson's life shifted dramatically in 1991 when he announced to the world that he was HIV positive. At the time, HIV was widely misunderstood and deeply stigmatized. Fear dominated public discourse, and a diagnosis was often seen as a death sentence. Johnson's announcement shattered that narrative and permanently altered conversations around the disease. Unlike many before him, Johnson had access to cutting-edge treatment, rigorous medical monitoring, and the ability to restructure his life around long-term health management. Antiretroviral therapy transformed HIV from a fatal illness into a chronic condition, allowing him not only to survive, but to remain active decades later. However, survival did not eliminate fear, especially within his family. For his wife, Cookie Johnson, the diagnosis introduced immediate anxiety surrounding transmission trust and the future of their marriage. The early years required strict precautions, constant testing, and psychological adjustment. Living with an incurable virus meant vigilance became permanent. Years later, illness returned in a different form when Cookie Johnson was diagnosed with breast cancer. Though detected at an early stage, treatment required surgery and hormonal therapy. The experience reversed roles magic once the patient became the caregiver. The household once again revolved around appointments, recovery, and uncertainty. What distinguishes Johnson's story is adaptation. Rather than retreating, he used his platform to fund research, promote education, and normalize long-term treatment. His openness helped reduce stigma and changed public understanding of HIV globally. Magic Johnson's journey illustrates that illness does not define a person, but it reshapes priorities. His life reflects endurance, not through denial, but through transparency, discipline, and long-term responsibility. Fame did not protect him from disease, but it gave him a voice, and he chose to use it to extend life, not just his own, but for millions of others. Diahann Carroll. Diahann Carroll embodied elegance, intelligence, and historic achievement. As the first Black woman to star in a network television series in a non-stereotypical role, she altered the landscape of American entertainment. Yet her final chapter unfolded quietly, defined not by trailblazing success, but by caregiving loss and physical decline. In the early 2000s, Carroll's life became centered around her husband's battle with late-stage prostate cancer. The disease progressed, steadily weakening mobility and requiring continuous medical supervision. Carroll stepped away from professional commitments, choosing privacy over presence in the public eye. Daily routines shifted toward medication management, personal care, and emotional support. Caregiving demanded both strength and surrender. Cancer does not only attack the body, it reshapes households, compresses time, and exhausts emotional reserves. Carroll navigated this reality with composure, though the toll was substantial. When her husband died in 2002, she faced the profound disorientation that follows prolonged caregiving, the sudden absence of purpose that illness had imposed. Grief did not end her challenges. In subsequent years, Carroll confronted her own serious health issues, including breast cancer. Treatment required surgery and recovery, forcing her to inhabit the patient's role after years spent as caregiver. The reversal underscored how illness circulates through life rather than resolving cleanly. Though she returned to acting briefly, Carroll's later years were marked by reflection rather than ambition. She spoke openly about vulnerability, acknowledging that achievement offers no exemption from decline. Aging, she noted, demands honesty more than resistance. Diane Carroll died in 2019 at the age of 84. Her legacy extends beyond firsts and accolades. It includes the grace with which she faced illness, both another's and her own, without spectacle. Carroll's story reminds us that even lives defined by visibility ultimately confront moments where love, endurance, and presence matter more than recognition. These stories remind us that behind every record, every trophy, and every standing ovation stands a human being facing the same fragility as anyone else. Fame may amplify voices, but it cannot silence illness, fear, or loss. Some endured quietly, others broke under the weight, but none were immune. So the question remains, does greatness protect us, or does it simply make our suffering more visible? Which story moved you the most, and why? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more untold histories behind the legends, subscribe to Legends of Black Fame, where the spotlight reveals more than success.